The lamp was swinging, spinning so fast that the light from the colored glass panels swirled and blended together into a crazy pool of color on the shining tabletop. Abby watched it go around, faster and faster, until she was dizzy from watching and had to look away. Then she heard the sound. Not a gasp, really, just a soft intake of breath, coming from somewhere near the lamp. She looked back, and there was the hand, white and delicate, reaching toward the lamp. At the touch of a slender finger, the lamp stopped spinning. Then Abby heard another sound. A sigh, as soft and delicate as the hand. A sigh of satisfaction. She'd dreamed it the night before. Now, looking at the book spattered with dark red drops of Holly's blood, Abby shuddered and closed her eyes. She'd been warned. She'd been warned in her dream, but she hadn't remembered in time to help. Holly needed 4 stitches in her head, but she was all right. Even so, Abby couldn't forget what had happened, or what she'd dreamed. That was when the dreams began to haunt her. When she tried to keep her eyes from closing at night, afraid of what might happen if she dreamed again. But she had to sleep. And when she did dream again, it was worse. Much worse. Not the dream, but the reality. The horrible reality that Abby didn't see until it was almost too late, until she woke one night to the sound of her mother's voice, hoarse with fear, shouting for Abby to come and help her. Abby stumbled across the room and pulled open the door, saw her mother's back disappearing down the stairs. Barefoot, her mind still cobwebbed with sleep, she followed Deanna down and out the back door into the cool night air. The crackling sound was soft, almost soothing. The smell reminded Abby of summer camp. But there was nothing comforting about the sight of the flames licking at the bottom of the boards. Abby stopped, frozen in horror for one painful second, then rushed after her mother across the weedy backyard toward the burning treehouse where Lindsay lay sleeping. For Lindsay, the reality of Abby's third dream was agony, the agony of scorched flesh on her shoulders and back and hands. Deanna cried when the doctor said Lindsay was lucky. They were first-degree burns. She could have died, but she would live. No one knew how the fire had started. The treehouse was close to the street that ran near the backyard, and Deanna thought that some idiot must have tossed a match from a car. But Abby knew better, because she'd seen it. She'd seen it in her dream. Hours before her mother's cry had pulled her from sleep, she'd seen the match, not tossed from a car, but torn from a matchbook, and struck into flame by a slender white hand. Sitting in the hospital room, with Lindsay sleeping in the bed and her mother dozing fitfully in a chair, Abby tried to gulp back the tears, but she couldn't. Her shoulders shook, but she cried silently, the tears spilling from her eyes and dripping from her chin onto her clenched hands. After a while, she'd wiped her cheeks and held her hands in front of her face. Small, but wide, with blunt, squared-off fingertips like her father's. Not like the dream hands, delicate and pale and deadly. Whose hands did she see in her sleep? Another week went by before Abby dreamed again, a week when the weather turned cooler and the leaves on the trees dropped down in bushels. Lindsay was much better, but she didn't go into the backyard, and there was no talk of building another treehouse. No one talked of the fire, but everyone remembered the horror of that night and how close Lindsay came to death. Abby went to bed each night afraid to sleep, and dragged through the days wondering what she'd see when she did sleep. She knew she'd dream again, and she was terrified of what would happen. Mark Halpern brought her a Coke after school, and Abby was too tired and worried to even try to have a good time. No one was more surprised than Abby when he asked her out for Saturday night. "I'll pick you up at 7:30, he said as they stood on her front porch in the late afternoon. He smoothed back his dark blonde hair and smiled at her. "A movie and some food. Does that sound okay?" Abby was about to say it sounded great when the front door opened and Lindsay stepped out. She was carrying the doll by one leg. "It fell," she said defensively to Abby. "I was walking by your room and I saw it on the floor." Abby took the doll and smoothed down the heavy lilac skirt. "So why didn't you put her back on the shelf?" "Because I heard you talking and I wanted to know who was with you." Lindsay looked at Mark, smirked, and went back inside. "You like dolls, huh?" Mark asked. Abby laughed a little. "I found her in the attic. She's really old." Mark took the doll in his hands still tan from the summer, and looked it over. Nice, he said. He raised his eyes to Abby's face. But not as nice as you. He shook his head and chuckled as if he realized how corny he'd sounded. But then he leaned close and touched his lips to Abby's. Abby supposed it was an awkward kiss, with the doll stuck between them and Abby herself so surprised she didn't do anything but stand there. But it didn't seem to matter. Mark smiled at her again, put the doll into her hands, and headed for his car. He folded his long legs into the tomato-red compact, tooted the horn once, and then he was gone. Abby stood still a moment, hugging the doll against her chest, before she headed into the house. She dreamed again on Friday night. She woke at midnight, her legs tangled in the sheets, the blood pounding in her ears. The sense of danger had been overwhelming, and it stayed with her through the night, snapping her awake every hour until she finally gave up and watched the sun rise through the kitchen window. She could see the hands again, but not only the hands. She could see an entire figure, a small one, maybe a child's. The figure was in shadow, though, and she couldn't tell much about it, just the delicate hands and the curve of a pale cheek. But it was moving, walking. Abby heard a crunch of gravel on a road, the swish of a dust, saw the dress, saw the tip of a shiny black shoe. And she heard another sound, the sound of breathing that broke into a soft, excited giggle as the figure skimmed quickly along. Then the figure was running down the road, scattering pebbles under its feet, its breath coming faster and faster. Abby could feel her own breath speed up. She didn't know what was coming. She only knew that it was going to be bad. But she didn't know how bad until she saw the glare of headlights, heard the hum of an engine turn into a roar as the car got closer and closer, saw the small, shadowy figure step deliberately into the path of the oncoming car. Then came the screech of brakes and the sickening sounds of crunching metal and shattering glass. There was a moment of silence, and then came the last sound Abby heard before she woke, a soft, whispery giggle. It was Saturday now, a day when she should have been counting the hours until Mark came to pick her up. Instead, she drifted through the day in a haze of depression, the memory of her dreams hanging over her like a dark weight. Erin had been lucky. She could have easily tumbled to the bottom of the steep stairs and broken her neck. Holly had been lucky, too. The glass could have sliced into her eyes or neck, blinding or killing her. Lindsay might have died in the flames, charred and blackened like the boards of her treehouse. And now this fourth dream. Would Abby read about the crash in tomorrow's newspaper? Would she see the words telling her what she already knew? That there'd been a car crash, that someone had been hurt, that maybe a child had been hit. Tired and edgy, Abby spent most of the day moving from room to room, gazing out the windows at Lindsay and her mother, who were raking leaves. There had been frost on the ground this morning. Soon the grass would turn brown and brittle, the trees would be empty and skeletal, and the darkness would come earlier and earlier. At 7, Abby took a shower and washed her hair. Under the sharp, hot needles of water, she felt her tense muscles relax a little, and the dull headache she'd had all day started to ease. Wrapped in a thick terry robe, she padded back to her room. She was staring into the closet, her eyes roving over and rejecting shirts and skirts and pants, when she heard the sound, that childish giggle. It was so clear, so close, that without thinking, Abby whirled around, expecting to see someone right behind her. But the room was empty. Shaking her head as if to clear it, Abby turned back to the closet. She was reaching for a dark orange blouse, soft and silky to the touch, when she noticed the time. 8 o'clock. Mark was half an hour late. An hour later, Abby brought the cordless phone into her room and called Mark's house. If she'd stopped to think, she might have wondered about her pounding heart and shaking hands. She might have realized that they were caused by something much more horrible than the thought or the fear that Mark had stood her up. But she didn't stop to think. So when Mark's mother answered and Abby asked to speak to him, she was completely unprepared. Abby stood frozen in the middle of her room, while Mark Halpern's mother, her voice thick with tears, told her that Mark was dead, that he'd died in the hospital that afternoon. He was driving home from a friend's house, Mrs. Halpern said. He was a good driver, a careful driver, but of course he had to swerve him. She stopped a moment, and Abby heard her swallow several times. He was only going 35. At least that's the posted speed limit there. But the police told us that even at that speed, when you hit a tree... She stopped again. Abby's mouth was dry, and when she spoke, her voice cracked. Why? She asked. You said he had to swerve. Why? Because of the little girl, Mrs. Helpburn said. When they were putting him into the ambulance, he told them he'd seen a little girl run into the road. He was very clear about it. They looked and looked, but they never found her. Her voice broke completely then, and all she could say was goodbye. Abby switched off the phone and closed her eyes. A wave of dizziness hit her. She knew she ought to sit down before she fell, but she couldn't move. She could only stand there, so dizzy she felt herself swaying. That's when she heard it again. A happy, impish, childlike giggle. And it was close. So close that Abby could hear the indrawn breath before it came a second time. Abby opened her eyes, but she didn't move. She held her breath, waiting, knowing she'd hear it again. When she did, when that eerie, whispery giggle drifted toward her across the room, she slowly turned around and stared into the doll's glittering sky-blue eyes. A little girl. A little girl in a purple dress with slender, pale hands and shiny black shoes. Just like the doll Abby had freed from the rubble in the attic and... what? Brought to life? Brought to life so her fine china hands could trip one friend on the stairs, send a lamp crashing onto another friend's head, strike a match, and set the treehouse ablaze with her sister inside it? Brought to life so she could dash into the road and kill an innocent 16-year-old boy? Then, as Abby stood there, she watched in terror as the doll's eyes changed, came alive, shifted in the lifeless china face and focused directly on Abby. In the eyes was a look of triumph. It lasted only a second, but that was enough. There was life there. Some kind of life, some kind of deadly force that had killed and would go on killing until somebody stopped it. Abby knew what she had to do. Swallowing a scream, she strode to the shelf and snatched up the doll. She didn't look into its eyes again. If there was life there, she did not want to see it. Sobbing in her need to get rid of it, she thrust the doll into that beautiful wooden box that she'd polished until it gleamed. It looks like a coffin, Abby thought as she slammed down the lid and pushed the shiny brass catch in place. A satin-lined coffin for a doll. 10 minutes later, Abby pulled her mother's car to stop on the cliff road. The box was in the seat next to her. As she reached for it, she heard a sound coming from it. A faint pattering sound, like pebbles. It wasn't pebbles, though. It was tiny china fists battering against wood. Then Abby was out of the car, the wind tearing at her hair, standing at the edge of the cliff with the box in her hands. She didn't hesitate. With all the strength she had, she threw the box over the cliff and watched it, turning over and over, its brass catch winking in the moonlight, until it disappeared into the darkness below. Abby stood alone on the top of the cliff. She was shivering from the cold, but she had to wait, had to be sure. Straining her ears, she listened until she heard, faint but distinct, the clattering sound as the box struck the sharp boulders at the base of the cliff. She heard it hit once, twice, 3 times. And then there was silence. It was over. The doll was gone, and Abby turned to go home, knowing she could sleep and never see those pale, deadly hands again. The man had finally pried the latch open. As he looked inside, he smiled, surprised and pleased. It was funny what some people threw away. He was sure that this was a genuine antique, probably worth a lot of money. The hands and face were fine china, and he bet the dress was real satin. They didn't make dolls like this anymore. Antique or not, though, he wasn't going to sell it. Not with Christmas on the way. Not when he had a daughter who was 9 years old and still crazy about dolls. Yes, this would make a perfect gift for her. With a satisfied chuckle, he tucked the box under his arm and headed home.